Today's protest took place this morning outside the Moscone Center, where the American Public Transit Association is holding its annual convention.
I don't care if you're in a wheelchair or not. You don't run into me.
The demonstrators came from all over the nation, seeking a federal mandate for all cities with a public transit system to install wheelchair access on buses and trains. The association opposes this plan.
They insisted on taking the train or the bus, even when the law said they had no such right. And except for their bravery that led them to take that stand, they were just regular people, like this guy, Jack Warren, who was hauled by police off a city bus in Cincinnati on May 19, 1986. Mr. Warren was hauled off that bus and arrested for the crime of insisting that he should be allowed to ride with everybody else, even though he had a disability and even though he had mobility issues. He was part of a civil rights group called ADAPT, Americans Disabled for Public Transit. They were founded in Denver in 1983. They're active in cities across the U.S. back then and still now in some cities. This footage here comes from San Francisco in 1986. Activists in wheelchairs facing down city buses and police officers, chaining themselves to the bus wheels, knowing they would be arrested, knowing that nothing says something is wrong here more clearly than getting arrested for the crime of asking to pay your fare and get on board just like everybody else. Pressured by those dramatic protests and these activists making their case, it was President George H.W. Bush, Poppy Bush, who responded by signing historic legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was a huge leap forward for our country. It's why we have wheelchair lifts on buses now, and handicapped restrooms in public places, and curb cuts and sidewalks, and instructions in Braille on ATMs. It's why you can bring a service dog with you everywhere. The Americans with Disabilities Act says you cannot be discriminated against in this country just because you have a disability. There needs to be some reasonable accommodation made so people with disabilities can access the same public accommodations that we all can. Poppy Bush signed that law in 1990, nearly a quarter century ago. This week, Senator John McCain said America is a more loving and caring nation because we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the reason that John McCain was saying that publicly this week is because this week the United States Senate had been considering a treaty modeled on the Americans with Disabilities Act to persuade other countries around the world to do what we have done, to treat our law like the gold standard for all countries, to which all countries should aspire. It's kind of flattering, right? I mean, our civil rights advance, one that was hard fought, but won. Our civil rights advance, a model for the world. So far, this treaty has been signed by 154 countries, including the U.S. It's been ratified by another 126 nations, not including the U.S. President Obama, in other words, signed it a couple years ago, but it has not yet been ratified by the United States Senate. To be clear, this UN treaty would not require anything from us at all. We already have disability rights and a legal framework for enforcing those rights. This treaty just pushes other countries to do what we have done. By ratifying that treaty, we would commit on an international level to what we already believe in here. Ratifying that treaty would help us lead the rest of the world to catch up to that historic leap that we took as a country back when President Bush I signed that landmark legislation. And with the exception of a nutso black helicopter conspiracy theory on the right, championed by failed presidential candidate and failed Senator Rick Santorum, who I should mention is now a columnist at a white secessionist birther website. That's his job now. Except for his nutso black helicopter conspiracy theories, ratifying this treaty was sort of a political no-brainer. I mean, this treaty has bipartisan support and not the usual token bipartisan support. I mean, this has the real thing, real bipartisan support from leading Democrats and leading Republicans. This treaty has vocal support from veterans. So many of them return from war with disabilities sustained in the service of their country. Veterans are as potent a constituency as you will find in American politics today on both sides of the aisle. Decorated Vietnam combat veterans John McCain and John Kerry, these two men who have been rivals in the Senate on everything short of which way is up and which way is down, these two men have been bipartisan leaders together on this treaty. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has united the seemingly ununitable. And so the vote was scheduled today in the Senate. Ratifying a treaty takes a two-thirds vote, so you need 66 yay votes. Former Senator Bob Dole was there at the Senate for the occasion, in his wheelchair after a hospital stay. The decorated wounded combat veteran from World War II, the former Republican presidential nominee on the floor of the Senate, he was there with his wife, there on the floor of the Senate. So senators had to walk past him in his wheelchair on the way in to vote. and the Republicans in the Senate voted no. The UN Treaty on Disability Rights got 61 votes from our Senate, which is a majority, but you need a two-thirds supermajority to ratify a treaty, and only 8 Republicans voted for the treaty. It requires nothing of us. 38 Republicans voted no, and so the whole treaty failed by a handful of votes. So forget Poppy Bush, Republican president, forget John McCain, war hero, forget Bob Dole in his wheelchair in the Senate where he served for decades, forget our wounded combat veterans in their wheelchairs, forget them all. Republicans are now instead going with Rick Santorum and the nutso black helicopter theory instead. Now, this year, in 2012, they did that today. Amazing. Joining us now is Steve Clemons from the New America Foundation. He writes at the Washington Note and at the Atlantic magazine, where he's Washington editor-at-large. Steve's also a former policy advisor for New Mexico Senator Jeff Bingaman, where he worked on a bunch of different international agreements. Mr. Clemons, thank you for being here.
Great to be with you, Rachel.
Am I being naive to have thought that this was going to pass?
No, I think a lot of people thought it would pass because of all the treaties that are pending, this one would have seemed like the easiest to pass. There's a Law of the Seas treaty. There are other treaties out there that have been pending for a long time. This is about people in need, and it didn't. This is a branch of the GOP that doesn't represent all Republicans, but it's the pugnacious, obnoxious nationalist wing that really resents any international deal making. And there's a lot of worry, not just about people with disabilities, but all the other treaties that position the United States and show that it can be the primary sculptor of global affairs in a way that serve Americans. And we're defecting from that as of today's vote.
So 126 countries ratifying this, but us not ratifying it, particularly when it is modeled on our law. You're saying that essentially takes us out of a global leadership role?
It leaves a void, and it sends signals to the rest of the world that the United States is walking away from the responsibility of primary leadership in the world, of sculpting global affairs in ways that are not only good for Americans, but for others in the world. And what was really tragic about today, as you said, this lifted up standards in the rest of the world. You know, John Kerry made a bit of a mistake on the floor. He was saying, support the UN on this, support the UN. It's not supporting the UN. This is supporting Americans with disabilities when they go to Istanbul, Turkey, when they go to Saudi Arabia, when they go to China, when they go to India, when they go around the world. This is basically saying to these other places, dignity and respect and access matter for people, and that the terms of equality that exist in other people's law should apply to those with disabilities. That, I can't believe that would be controversial, and that you would have essentially only 61 senators in the United States Senate vote yes on this.
The Republicans, I'm not going to go into Rick Santorum's black helicopter crazy conspiracy theory on this because I don't want to dignify it with verbiage. But I recognize that the Republicans have crazy conspiracy theories about the UN. The thing that strikes me about this one in particular is that you had Bob Dole and Poppy Bush and John McCain and all of these sort of Republican
elders. Well, it almost says that none of them can be Republicans today, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, they're talking about Chuck Hagel. An extreme rhino, Republican in name only, possibly getting a position in the Obama administration. But what is Bob Dole, who is a candidate for president? What is John McCain, who voted for this? Are they now rhinos? Are they the new rhinos? I mean, that's what it really means, is that the Republican Party has moved so far away from their standard bearers, incumbents in government. I mean, I think it was one of the saddest things I've seen to see these senators walk by Bob Dole, salute him, and then essentially vote against him.
And saying, Senator, if you want to travel abroad while you're using that wheelchair, we actually have we are going to take no responsibility for ensuring your dignity and respect abroad.
No, it's, yeah.
I know that you've been in touch with Senator Lugar and with Senator Hagel recently. Senator Lugar obviously is in a poignant spot in his career, leaving the Senate after having been primaried by somebody who then lost in the general election. President Obama paying elaborate tribute to Dick Lugar this week, talking on issues of nuclear security. When you talk with Senator Lugar and Senator Hagel, what are they expressing about their views about what's happening in their own party right now?
I think they're concerned. I mean, I think they're concerned in a constructive way. Just as I've heard, to be honest, Democrats occasionally express concern about movements there. But I think when I listen to Richard Lugar talk about the face of American internationalism and the fact that this used to be an easy place for Democrats and Republicans to stand together and to support a principled engagement in the world, that Lugar and others that are no longer in the Senate, like Hagel, others that left the party and became independents, like Lincoln Chafee, who's now governor of Rhode Island. There's a group of Republicans that just said, this isn't working for us anymore. And what you've seen is a senator not that many people talk about anymore, but you see the ghost of Jesse Helms in in all of this. Jesse Helms was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 1990s, suspended our payments to the United Nations. It was during Helms's tenure in foreign relations that many of the so-called conspiracies, the little signs with the United Nations, and when I worked for Jeff Bingham in New Mexico, these signs were everywhere, block and ban the UN.
Yeah.
And it was the year of the child, and it was exactly like this, where people believed that they were going to be told how to raise their children, and that's what essentially came undone. This is that the Homeschooling League began to animate voters because they believed that this treaty would somehow circumvent American sovereignty and would basically result in people losing control of their children. So it's a fantastical. Horrible interpretation of a treaty that would have been very, very good for this. And I think you don't want to talk about Santorum, but Santorum is a lawyer. And he was a lawyer before he ran, and he knows better than what he did. And that's what's sad, is Lugar is the best in the Republican Party, is a great leader, great principled person who's helped make the entire world safe. None Lugar, dismantling and disabling nuclear weapons and materials has been so vital. But I tell you, the United States is in a fragile place in the rest of the world, because a lot of our allies doubt our ability to stand with them when they're in trouble, when we have these kinds of things. And we need to communicate to them that we're going to be there. And right now, when you look at the cast of cards and cast of characters involved, it looks doubtful. Yeah, and those conspiracy theories, the fact that they are not new, tells you something. They are always out there, ready to be tapped by politicians who do not have the better angels of our nature in mind. And the fact that that's where they're going after this election I find it stunning. Steve Clemens, New America Foundation, editor of the Washington Note, and the Atlantic's Washington editor at large. They're lucky to have you. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you.
All right, we'll be right back.